What's the best 357 Magnum loads for a snub nose revolver? So I'm going to go through a lot of the ammo that I have tested, because I've tested quite a bit out of this 2-inch barrel revolver here, and tell you what's the best ammunition that I would recommend for the average person to go and get for, a snub nose 357 Magnum. So all these tests are going to be done from my Taurus 605 357 Magnum revolver. And the reason why I use this is because I was kind of looking at getting a Smith & Wesson Model 60 several years ago, and I really couldn't afford it. And I found this one, and this was essentially half the price of the Model 60 with pretty much the same specs. The Model 60, it weighs 21.5 ounces. This thing weighs 21 ounces on my scale, even though Taurus website said this weighs 24 ounces. And it's been such a good revolver for me that I've never really felt the need to upgrade. And I can't say that for all Taurus products, but this particular revolver has been very, very good for me. So I have continued to use it. So what I want to say here is I definitely would not recommend really any of these loads for a revolver that's not a steel framed revolver. But something like this, or a Model 60 at that 21 ounce weight, it's just light enough you can easily carry it, but also it's just heavy enough to soak up recoil. So I'm going to go through the list of my top 10 loads that have performed really, really well. And keep in mind here, when you're talking about a 357 Magnum, pretty much most ammo performs pretty well out of a 357, even if it's a short barrel. So what we're looking at is not looking at like what's the most powerful or what necessarily did the most damage, but what we're looking at is that most loads perform pretty well. Now let's filter it down from there. What ones have a little bit less recoil and were more consistent? Which ones were more shootable? That's where I'm really looking at from this. So you're going to see some loads that might be lower down on the list as better loads that might not be super powerful, but I think that they are great loads for a 357 Magnum snub nose revolver. And also, I'm not going to include rounds from like Underwood or Buffalo Bore or anything like that, because a majority of those loads are made with XTP bullets, and even though they might be very powerful, most of the time they're painfully powerful out of a short barrel. They're hard to shoot, plus the XTP bullets don't perform all that well. So I'm going to exclude those, and I'm going to stick with pretty much mainstream companies, and I'm going to go through a list of what has performed really well for me. But first I'm going to mention a couple loads that performed absolutely terrible, and I would say don't use those. One would be the Blazer 357 Magnum 158 grain jacketed hollow point. Terrible performance with that. I got 1,019 feet per second, 364 foot-pounds energy, but with that I got 21.5 inches of penetration and an expanded diameter of only 0.448. Another terrible one is going to be our Freedom Munitions X-Def ammunition. That's a 125 grain jacketed hollow point, 1129 feet per second, 354 foot-pounds energy, and it penetrated to 17.5 inches, which is a good penetration, but the expansion was 0.379, essentially no expansion. I was really kind of blown away that we saw no expansion. You never see that, but that's something that I saw with Freedom Munitions. So I have a couple honorable mentions here before I start this top 10 list. The first one's going to be our Fiocchi Defense Dynamics, and this is specifically the 148 grain variant. Now I tested the 158 grain and the 125 grain, and surprisingly this did better than both of those. With our 148 grain, we had 1,086 feet per second on average, 388 foot-pounds energy. Not particularly powerful, but what I got is 16 inches of penetration and an expanded diameter of 0.611. So that did really, really well overall for a cheap 357 Magnum. The 158 grain, I think it didn't expand really at all. Yeah, we had no expansion with the 158 grain, and just kind of a weird expansion with the 125 grain. Another honorable mention is going to be our HTP and our 110 grain bullet here. I have one of them up there. That was an okay round. The problem with that the 110 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. We got 1309 feet per second, 418 foot-pounds energy. Very powerful, but we got only 9¼ inches of penetration. It did expand to 0.575, which is pretty good, but really with that, it's almost like there's such a massive fireball that comes out. It's like its bark is massive for a kind of a mediocre bite. It just didn't perform all that well. Just way too much flash for me to consider that to be a good defensive round. So now let's start with our top 10 list, and I'll show you the 10 best performing rounds in order, and in my order. You know, these are not going to go by power or penetration or expansion. They're going to go by, you know, overall, how they perform overall with the recoil, performance, and with are they available in common rounds. So let's start. So I also want to make a mention that every one of these rounds I tested went through 4 layers of fabric, 3 inches of clear ballistics, a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum, and then in the clear ballistics, into more clear ballistics. So what I just mentioned also went through the rib simulation. So everything on this top 10 also is going to be going through that rib simulation. So keep that in mind, because I do find that the rib simulation being part of this test makes it more valid, because it's more likely you're going to hit ribs in a real defensive shooting, and ribs make a big difference in how a bullet will perform. So number 10 is going to be our Federal HST 154 grain jacketed hollow point. Now, as far as thermal ballistics go, this did really well. What we got going on with that is 1102 feet per second on average, 415 foot-pounds energy, 20 3/4 inches of penetration, expanded diameter of 0.572, and it did HST things. It expanded right away and cut a really good path, a wound path. It looked very destructive. So as far as thermal ballistics go, this did fantastic. You might even say this is 1 or 2 or 3 on the top performers. The problem with this, though, is that the recoil, you know, it is a 154 grain. So there's massive recoil, massive muzzle jump out of a snub-nose revolver. So I wouldn't realistically look at it as appropriate for a snub-nose revolver, even though it did pretty well. So that's our number 10. Our number 9 is actually going to be our Remington HTP, and this would count for the UMC as well, our 158 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. What I got with that is 1150 feet per second on average and 464 foot-pounds energy. So that's a very powerful round. And what we got for performance is we got 12 3/4 inches of penetration with an expanded diameter of 0.598. There was a little bit of fragmentation involved in that, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's a 158 grain bullet. You got plenty to work with there. You can fragment off some and still going to do pretty well. So this did really well as far as thermal ballistics goes. But if you're looking at that foot-pounds energy and that bullet weight there, massive recoil. That's one you really don't want to shoot a lot of. It's like taking a baseball bat and hitting a tree with it. It just doesn't feel very comfortable, so you're less likely to practice with it, and it's just going to be kind of hard to use in a self-defense scenario. So that's number 9 on our list. Number 8 is actually going to be our Hornady Critical Duty 357 Magnum 135 grain, and that's a good bullet weight for a short barrel. You know, it's not too heavy, it's not too light, so it's kind of efficient. And what we got with this, or 135 grain FTX, 1227 feet per second on average, 451 foot-pounds energy. That's really good. And you can kind of see where this is going. That's a lot of energy for a short barrel there. We had a huge amount of energy dump going on there, and 19 inches of penetration, an expanded diameter of 0.488. So not a big expansion. Good penetration. It's a little bit deep, 19 inches. But of course, you know, you're dealing with a lot of recoil. And, you know, it wasn't as bad as that HTP, but the expansion was only 0.488. So it's just not what I would consider performing very well. And Critical Duty is really designed for service size handguns, 4 inches and above. So there's no wonder why it didn't perform great. And also the lead alloy is really meant for going through hard barriers. So if you had that niche need of needing to go through auto glass or car doors, this would actually do better than others. But most of the people, you know, using a stub nose 357 Magnum probably won't have that need. So number 7 on our list is actually our Winchester Silvertip, which I just tested. This is a 145 grain jacketed hollow point. And what I got with this is 1,055 feet per second, 368 foot-pounds energy. So it wasn't very powerful. 20 inches of penetration and 0.543 expansion. So checks off the box on the expansion of over 1.5 times. Penetrate a little deep, but didn't go through our rear rib simulation, so that's fine. And the takeaway from this was it's pretty low recoil. So when you're getting down into those energy numbers of, the energy of, a 4-inch barrel 9mm through a 2-inch barrel 357 snub, that's where it becomes shootable. So from here on out, most of these loads are going to be in that range. But a lot of people are like, well, why would I even want that? I could just carry 9mm. That's up to you to decide. But as far as my opinion goes from my testing, and my testing isn't just testing terminal ballistics, it's testing shootability. We're going to be a lot better performing overall if we keep that energy and those bullet weights down so that they're controllable. And this was the first round that was pretty controllable out of this list. So good performance overall. Number 6, I don't have a box for this. This was the Federal Train and Protect. Not bad performance overall. That is a 125 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. They call it the VHP, versatile hollow point, because they sell them in 50 round boxes. It's supposed to be economical enough that you can shoot them for target practice, but also use them for defense. Now with this ammo, it didn't perform bad, but it's pretty much a weakened version of your old school, Federal and Remington 125 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. And those will typically do 1,250 feet per second out of a snub. This was lightened down quite a bit. What we got with that is 1,147 feet per second on average, 365 foot-pounds energy. So, we're missing about 100 feet per second from where that load should be. That being said, because it's a semi-jacketed hollow point, we had immediate huge energy dump, big hole through our rib simulation. And what we got with that is 14 3/4 inches of penetration, 0.541 expansion, low recoil. So overall, I would say that's pretty much perfect. If I had to recommend one for a person that doesn't want to buy, target ammo and defensive ammo, I'm gonna say that's a really good round overall. So I would recommend that, but it's not our number 1 though. That's only at our number 6. So number 5 is going to be, the real version of what I just mentioned there. That's going to be our Remington HTP 125 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. This has more power. We were looking at 1,214 feet per second with this. Bunch of energy dump, huge hole through the MDF, obviously. 406 foot-pounds energy. The problem with this is when you do put that extra energy on there, what we got with this is only 10.5 inches of penetration, but we got a 0.596 expansion, average recoil. So this is like the Train and Protect, but better. And the Remington bullet's a little bit different than the Federal, so there's a little bit more lead there. So our penetration wasn't great at only 10.5 inches, but overall I'm going to say it's a good performer. And 10.5 is a good amount of penetration if you're not taking a side shot, but it's not really hitting that 12-inch minimum. But keep in mind there is rib simulation in there, so without that rib simulation we're going to hit that 12-inch minimum, but that's more of an energy dumping version of that Train plus Protect. So good round overall, but the recoil was pretty average for a 357 Magnum. It wasn't brutal, but pretty average. And for me, I'm going to look at rounds that are specifically lower recoil as better options, or maybe better bullet designs. So moving on now to our number 4. And I actually do see this ammo all the time when I go to stores. It's our TAC XPD 357 Magnum 125 grain solid copper hollow point. This is a really good round overall, to be honest. And because it's a 125 grain, it is going to have lower recoil, but because it's a solid copper bullet, and copper's less dense than lead, there's no lead core, and the hollow cavity is pretty big. What that means is that's going to be pushed in the case a little bit deeper than a typical 125 grain, so you can achieve full power with actually less powder. So that automatically means you're going to get less recoil, you're going to get less flash. So what I got going on with that, 125 grain copper hollow point, and I did 2 tests of this to that snub nose revolver. So I'm averaging these 2 tests into one result here. So our average between 2 tests was 1246 feet per second, 431 foot-pounds energy. So it has a lot of power, but not any more recoil than, you know, some of those rounds that are in the 350 foot-pounds energy range. So it's kind of a hack here in the firearms world. And that longer bullet's going to seal that cylinder gap a little bit longer. Huge hole through the MDF, huge energy dump. Average penetration is 12.34 inches of penetration. It's a little bit low because, you know, copper's a little bit less dense, or sectional density, you know, I don't think it's any greater or less, but it just slows down quicker because it expands out to 0.659 average expansion, massive expansion, and a bigger wound tract, way bigger wound tract than average, but, you know, less recoil. So overall, I'm going to say this is probably one of our top performers. It's just that, you know, it's not always available everywhere, and there's just a tad more recoil than my top, you know, performer on this list. So terminal ballistics wise, this is probably our top 1 or 2 performer, but overall I think there's better options here. So looking at our number 3 is a very similar option to our number 4 there. Pretty similar. Our 357 Magnum, our Corbon 125 grain DPX. Very similar bullet here, if not the same. Very similar. So what I got going on with that is 1225 feet per second, 416 foot-pounds energy. So it's like that Barnes, but a little bit less powerful, which means it has a little bit less recoil. So it's doing all the things that the Barnes TAC XP is doing, but it's doing with a little bit less recoil. So what I got with that is a huge hole through our MDF, 14 3/4 inches of penetration, which is right in that middle where we want to see. And what we got going on there is 0.667 of expanded hollow point, massive. It's a less recoil than our Barnes, with a bigger wound path and just a straighter path with a little more penetration over our Barnes. So honestly, I'm going to say this is number 1 for our terminal ballistics performance overall. Very good round. Number 2, and this is number 2 because it possesses a lot of the qualities of all of these, but it's probably the most available ammo, and it's pretty low recoil, and you get a lot of ammo for the money. And what that is our Hornady Critical Defense 125 grain FTX. You know, these are 25 round boxes, and I see these every time I've ever been to a gun store or a sporting goods store. These are there. And for being there and being for a 25 round box, it gives you a little extra ammo to practice with enough to carry, and being available, not too expensive, they perform pretty good. So what I got with that, I've tested it a whole bunch of times, but I'm just taking from one of these tests here because the tests are pretty average overall. What I got with that, 1257 feet per second on average, 438 foot-pounds energy, 14 1/4 inches penetration, 0.558 expansion, low recoil. So the thing with this is it is a low, they kind of hacked the system here with this. Many of you reloaders know that the Hornady brass is not great for reloading because it's shorter than typical. I have a basic Fiocchi round here of 357 Magnum, which is a typical round, and we'll compare the case length of that to the Critical Defense. It may be kind of hard to see on this camera, but the case on that Critical Defense is a hair shorter. And I think they do that specifically because if you make it, you know, longer than a 38, so it can't accidentally chamber in a 38, but just make it a little bit shorter than a typical 357 Magnum, what you can do is you can make the overall length longer, and by doing that you can push that bullet in the case a little bit deeper, and by doing that you can actually achieve full power with a little bit less powder. So that's kind of what they're doing here. So really, when you look at, reloaders are like, I hate those cases. They kind of serve a purpose. And overall, you're getting full power, because this is, 438 foot-pounds energy of a 2-inch barrel, which far surpasses any 9mm plus P out of a similar sized gun. You're getting way more performance, but the recoil is just slow enough to be manageable. So I'm going to say overall, that's a pretty good option, and number 2 on my list. Number 1 on my list, I believe that this, has everything that you want out of a good performing round, but it's doing it with the least amount of recoil for the performance it is giving. And that is our Speer Gold Dot 135 grain short barrel. Now this one is not super powerful, and a lot of people complain about that, but it is designed very well. The bullet has a massive hollow cavity. So even though the energies of this is going to be similar to a 9mm out of a similar sized gun, or even out of a 2-inch 9mm revolver, it's going to be way better than a 9mm, because that hollow cavity is massive. It's kind of like the old school flying ashtray, how it's described. So that's going to give you very good performance, and it's a bonded bullet. So what we got going on with this, only 1,088 feet per second, which is only 335 foot-pounds energy. Not very high, but you would say, well, a 9mm does that. 9mm is not going to do that out of a short barrel like that with that bullet weight. So that's actually not a bad amount of energy for a 135 grain bullet, and being so low recoil. So 335 foot-pounds energy. Huge energy dump, huge hole through my rib simulation, just a huge expansion and big old wound path going on. The expanded diameter was 0.557, penetration 13.5. So even though the expanded diameter didn't like wind up as big as it could be, you have to understand that Gold Dot's kind of unique, and that they are kind of a thick plated bonded bullet type of thing. So they'll actually expand out really big and make a really big hole, and then they'll slowly kind of peel back. So even though we stopped at 13.5 inches at 5.57, it was likely well over 60 hundredths of an inch at one point when it's energy dumping, and then it just kind of peels back. So what sets this aside from everything else is the recoil was super low. I mean, I don't think it's the lowest on this list, but it's probably one of the, if we took 3 out of this whole list here, it's within that. Very low recoil, more power than a 38, more performance than a 9mm, and just easy to control, like I said. Good performance overall. So I'm going to say overall, our best performing round for the recoil is going to be this. But I would say this is a runner-up for performance for the recoil. And our critical defense is number 2, because it's everywhere and easy to find. So that's what I found through my testing throughout the years, at least out of this Taurus 605, and you're going to feel the same recoil out of a Smith & Wesson Model 60. Very, good performance out of a lot of these rounds, but there surprisingly are some that don't do all that well, and there are some that do very well, but the recoil isn't that great. So when we get lowered on this list, so these top 5 here, I would stick within those for what I would carry: our Barnes TAC XPD, our Corbon DPX, our critical defense, or our Gold Dot short barrel. I think those are our best performing rounds overall. So that's my list of our top performing snub nose 357 Magnum rounds. So that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.